The wind over the Silesian plain in January 1945 did not just blow. It cut like a jagged horizontal blade of ice that turned human breath into needles. On the morning of January 23rd, the temperature plummeted toward minus 20 degrees Celsius. The sky hung low and heavy, a bruised purple-gray that promised only more snow. On the roads leading west out of Breslau, the silence was more terrifying than the distant, rhythmic thud of Soviet heavy artillery. It was a silence born of absolute, bone-deep exhaustion. Thousands upon thousands of women, children, and the elderly moved in a slow, stumbling column. Their boots crunched into 2 feet of fresh powder. Among them was Frau Hanisch, her arms aching with the weight of her infant daughter, Gabby. She had wrapped the child in every scrap of wool she possessed. But as the hours turned into a rhythmic, mechanical trudge, the weight in her arms began to change. It grew heavier, then strangely light, then stiff. When she finally dared to peel back the frozen shawl, the child's face was a waxen, porcelain mask. The eyes were fixed and clear like marbles. There was no time for a grave because the earth was as hard as iron. She simply laid the small bundle in a roadside snowdrift, a tiny white hummock among hundreds of others, and kept walking. To stop was to die. This was the Canth Death March. It was the moment the air raid shelter of the Reich collapsed into a mass grave. All of this was triggered because Gauleiter Karl Hancke had scrawled a signature declaring the city a fortress. Civilian life was now merely fuel for the furnace of a doomed ideology. For years, the people of Breslau had lived in a cocoon of perceived safety, watching from a distance as Berlin and Dresden were hollowed out by fire. But to understand this winter nightmare, we must look back far beyond the first Soviet shell. We must go back to a time when the sun felt permanent, and the city was still known as the flower of Europe. In July 1938, the air in Breslau smelled of heavy hydrangeas and the sweat of 150,000 athletes. During the German Gymnastics and Sports Festival, the Schlossplatz was a sea of synchronized movement. It was a propaganda masterpiece orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels. From a towering wooden rostrum, Adolf Hitler looked out over a fiery border of torches. The flames illuminated the black tunics of the SS Leibstandarte. The soundscape was a deafening, intoxicating roar. The Badenweiler March echoed off the Baroque facades, while the crowd screamed in a happy fusion with their leader. For a young Ulrich Frodian, standing in the press of bodies, the world felt solid and glorious. His mother leaned down to whisper that a wonderful future was beginning. The city's cosmopolitan past, as a hub of the Amber Road, was being systematically rewritten. Nazi historians repurposed the invasion of 1241, telling the citizens they were the final bulwark against the Asiatic hordes. This myth felt like a grand adventure in the golden light of 1938. They had no idea it would become a literal prophecy of their own annihilation. This radicalization had been forged in the crucible of post-World War I misery. A decade earlier, 1 in 10 residents had been jobless. They wandered streets where hyperinflation made a loaf of bread cost a wheelbarrow of marks. The bitter 1921 struggle for Upper Silesia had already primed the population to see their Slavic neighbors as existential threats. By 1933, the Nazi Party leveraged this economic despair to turn the city into a strictly monitored apparatus. The blocklighter system ensured that every 40 homes had a set of eyes watching for dissent. This turned the clenched fist in the pocket into the only safe form of protest. The soul of the city finally shattered on the night of November 9, 1938. As the sun went down, the smell of wood smoke was replaced by the acrid, oily stench of burning Torah scrolls. Ulrich Frodian, riding his bicycle through the evening gloom, heard the rhythmic clack-crunch of boots on shattered glass. He watched, mesmerized and horrified, as firemen stood with their arms crossed. Their brass helmets glinted in the light of the burning new synagogue on Angerstrasse. They were not there to fight the fire. They were there to ensure the flames did not spread to Aryan property. Neighbors who had shared coffee and trade for generations watched in a silent despair as Jewish storefronts were gutted. The glass underfoot sounded like frozen snow. It was the end of the multicultural flower of Europe and the birth of the witch's cauldron. The transition was complete. The vibrant trade hub had been hollowed out. It left only a fanatical shell that would, within 7 years, sacrifice its own children to the ice of the Canth Road. For years, while the rest of the Third Reich was being systematically ground into ash by Allied firebombing, Breslau existed in a state of surreal, suspended animation. It was the air raid shelter of the Reich, It was a city where the lace curtains remained white, and the coffee was still served on porcelain in the cafes. In 1941 and 1942, as the sky over Berlin turned into a permanent shroud of soot, Breslauers lived in a bubble of false security. The radio columns blared news of victories in the east. These reports were accompanied by the grand, soaring strains of Liszt's Le Preludes. This music masked a growing silent despair that had taken root since the invasion of Poland. By 1943, the city was a strange sanctuary. It was populated by evacuees from the bombed-out Ruhr and officials who still enjoyed a country club lifestyle. They drank honey-yellow beer with thick, frothy heads, while the industrial heart of the city shifted production to the four-engined leviathans of war. The illusion of immunity was not merely shattered, it was incinerated on the afternoon of October 7, 1944. The day began with a sky of piercing, crystalline blue. It was the kind of autumn afternoon that usually invited walks in the park. Then came the silver flashes. These were the glints of American B-17 bombers appearing like high-altitude ghosts. The air raid sirens, which had for years been a mere formality, now screamed with a terrifying urgency. In a city hospital, a concert for convalescing soldiers was in full swing when the first sticks of bombs began to walk across the city. The music stopped. It was replaced by the rhythmic, chest-thumping thud of high explosives. As the power grid failed, the world plunged into a flickering Stygian gloom. Surgeons, who moments before had been listening to Mozart, were forced to continue operating by the light of handheld candles. The air in the operating theaters grew thick with the smell of ozone and the copper tang of fresh blood. Outside, the oil depot had become a volcanic pillar of fire. It cast an eerie, hellish glow over the skyline. As night fell, flares hung in the sky like Christmas trees. They illuminated 69 dead and a population that suddenly realized their city was no longer a shelter. It was a target. This psychological collapse triggered a frantic, uncoordinated lurch toward fortification known as Operation Barthold. Gauleiter Karl Hancke, obsessed with the myth of the 1341 Mongol invasion, ordered the construction of an east wall. It was a massive anti-tank ditch, 20 feet wide and 13 feet deep. The project was a monument to logistical incompetence and human cruelty. Over 100,000 people were pressed into service. This included Polish forced laborers who were treated as sandpaper, a material to be used until worn thin and then discarded. The atmosphere at the digging sites was defined by a soul-crushing boredom, punctured by moments of visceral horror. Laborers endured the overpowering stench of makeshift latrines and the squelch of boots in freezing mud. At the nearby Bertha-work facility, concentration camp inmates rose at 4:30 in the morning in rags and broken clogs to produce howitzers. They were often beaten for the simple crime of asking for food. This was the reality behind the Nazi propaganda photos that showed the factory's football teams and boxing matches. By the winter of 1944, the strategic reality had devolved into a bureaucratic fiction. In the Wolf's Lair, Hitler stood over maps, his hands trembling as he scrawled lines on charts that represented divisions existing only on paper. He dismissed reports of the Soviet buildup as the greatest bluff since Genghis Khan. He replaced seasoned commanders with fanatical loyalists. This strategic paralysis forced the institutionalization of the Volkssturm, the last throw of the dice. The streets of Breslau were now filled with the sight of grandfathers and 14-year-old boys in ill-fitting, oversized uniforms. They clutched Panzerfausts that cost a mere 8 Reichsmarks to produce. These armored fists were the only defense against the steel colossi of Soviet T-34s. The defenders were watched over by the chain dogs, the military police who enforced a regime of internal terror. A soldier caught questioning the wonder weapons or the political will of the Führer might find himself hanging from a railway bridge with a sign around his neck. While he swung in the wind, his parents would receive a bureaucratic letter claiming he had died like a man. As the new year of 1945 approached, the disconnection from reality reached its zenith. At a dinner in Joseph Goebbels' villa, the Nazi elite struggled to carve a tough old goose. It was a jarring moment of domestic banality, while the radio broadcast theories on total war. Outside, the hibernating war was ending. In the bunkers, the smell of cold, uneaten Christmas wine lingered alongside a rising sense of doom. The German soldier, his uniform a dirty green of filth and exhaustion, had ceased to laugh or tell jokes. They were trapped in a state of mechanical, weary movement. They were waiting for the mighty thrashing of Soviet artillery that would soon turn the flower of Europe into a landscape of metal skeletons and white blankets of snow-covered corpses. At 5 in the morning on January 12, 1945, the horizon east of the Vistula River did not brighten with the sun. It ignited with the muzzle flashes of 17,000 Soviet guns. This was the start of Marshal Ivan Konev's Vistula-Oder offensive. It was a bombardment so dense that the German defensive line, once touted as an impregnable wall, was revealed to be nothing more than a fragile wooden fence. The earth did not just shake, it liquefied under a density of 350 guns per mile. This was a mechanical plow that shattered the German Panzer Army in a matter of hours. As the Soviet steel arrows bypassed strongpoints and raced toward the heart of Silesia, the strategic fiction maintained by Berlin collapsed. In Breslau, the atmosphere shifted from the tension of waiting to the frantic, claustrophobic realization that the trap was closing. While the front lines dissolved into a chaos of burning Tiger tanks and retreating horse-drawn carts, Gauleiter Karl Hancke turned his fury inward. He began transforming the city from a failing administrative hub into a theater of state-sanctioned terror. On January 28, the transition to a fanatical fortress was sealed in blood at the Ring, the city's historic central square. Dr. Wolfgang Spielhagen, the deputy mayor, was marched out into the biting cold. His crime was defeatism, a catch-all charge for anyone who recognized the military reality that Hancke refused to acknowledge. In a cinematic display of cruelty, Spielhagen was tied to a recording truck. His shame was intended to be broadcast to the very citizens he had served. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the metallic tang of the winter air as the firing squad took their positions. The squad was composed of Volkssturm men whose hands shook in the -20-degree cold. The crack of the rifles echoed off the baroque facades of the square. It was a sound that signaled the end of civil society. Spielhagen's body was left as a grim sentinel. It was a warning that the regime now viewed its own people as mere human material to be burned in the furnace of the coming siege. By February 13th, the tactical map had become a death warrant. The Soviet pincers, moving with a vengeful momentum fueled by the memory of atrocities at Majdanek, finally locked at Domslau. The ring was closed. Inside the witch's cauldron, 150,000 civilians and a hodgepodge garrison of soldiers were now trapped. The city was no longer a place of habitation. It had become a Moloch, a self-consuming idol of war. To prepare for the street-to-street fighting, Hancke and the military command began the systematic weaponization of the city's infrastructure. Trams were not used for transport. They were hauled to intersections and tipped over. Their iron frames were filled with cobblestones to create barricades that soldiers knew would be useless against the heavy Soviet tanks. But the most surreal and haunting note of this preparation took place in the Scheitnig Park. General Major Hans von Alphen recognized that a bombardment would shatter the cages of the city's famous zoo. He ordered a slaughter of the innocents. In the grey light of the encroaching siege, the screams of exotic birds were drowned out by the rhythmic bark of service pistols. The blood of bears and lions spurted as thick as an arm across the frozen enclosures. It was a cinematic carnage that left the park silent and haunted. Tropical birds, escaped from their shattered aviaries, flitted like colorful ghosts through the blackened trees. They sang amidst the bleak, lifeless landscape. The city had been flayed of its humanity and its history. All that remained was a concrete shell where the Nazi greeting withered. It was replaced by the desperate, subterranean plea of the trapped, "Stay alive." The flower of Europe had been cut from its roots, prepared now only for the fire. By late March 1945, the sky over Breslau had ceased to be a natural phenomenon. It was a contested ceiling of iron, searchlights, and falling fire. The city was no longer being defended. It was being consumed by its own garrison. Under the Breslau method, the defenders had become more destructive than the besiegers. To create tactical killing fields, German engineers systematically dynamited entire blocks of historic apartments. They turned grand Baroque facades into heaps of jagged masonry. They carved a subterranean world, knocking through cellar walls to create a labyrinth that allowed soldiers to move beneath the ruins. Above them, the air was a permanent choking fog of pulverized brick and lye. The most grotesque monument to this nihilism was the construction of the Rollfeld. Gauleiter Karl Hancke realized the main airfield was falling and ordered the creation of a new, mile-long runway directly through the heart of the city's residential center. On a grey, freezing morning, the demolition began not with Soviet shells, but with German dynamite. The Kaiserstrasse, once one of the most beautiful boulevards in Central Europe, was erased. 60,000 forced laborers, women, elderly men, and concentration camp inmates were marched into the dust. They worked in a state of detached numbness, their hands raw and bleeding as they tore down the skeletons of luxury apartments and hauled the rubble away by hand. There was no mechanical equipment left. There was only the rhythmic chug of Soviet biplanes, the sewing machines droning overhead in the darkness to drop light bombs on the workers. 3,000 people died in the dust of the Kaiserstrasse. They were crushed by falling masonry or executed for faltering. All of this was done to build a runway that would serve no strategic purpose other than to provide a flight path for the Gauleiter's own eventual desertion. This desperate infrastructure was fed by the air bridge. It was a gauntlet in the sky that turned the Junkers' 52 transports into flying coffins. Pilots flying these machines approached the city through a sea of silver clouds that suddenly gave way to a hellish, fire-streaked landscape. As they descended, the searchlights of 90 Soviet anti-aircraft batteries caught them, turning the sky into a shining pearl necklace of flak bursts. Inside the cockpits, the smell of resin from the nearby mountains would briefly cut through the stench of leaking fuel and sweat. Then the planes dropped like pianos onto the cratered remains of the city. They brought in meager tons of ammunition and took out the mangled remains of the wounded. The waxen and cold faces of the dying were illuminated by the red glow of the burning suburbs. Then came Easter. The terror attack began on Palm Sunday, March 25th, and reached a crescendo that the priest Paul Pikert would record as the worst day in the 1,000-year history of the city. The Soviet command, frustrated by the stubbornness of the fortress, unleashed a 2-day firestorm. 340 aircraft moved in a single, massive wave. They dropped 5,000 bombs that transformed the city into a furnace of heat. The center of this apocalypse was the Cathedral Island and the Great State Library. As the high explosive sticks walked across the sand island, the air was sucked out of the cellars. It created a vacuum that made the lungs of the huddled civilians ache. In the library, the mania for destruction met the heritage of centuries: 500,000 volumes, manuscripts, rare books, and the collective memory of the region ignited. The sensory experience was overwhelming. There was the acrid smell of burning parchment and a hurricane of sparks that turned the night into a false, terrifying noon. The ruined cathedral towers were like scrawny fingers clawing at a sky choked with grey soot. From his 300-foot vantage point in a tower, priest Walter Lassmann watched the terrible reality of his world vanishing. The Oder River reflected a sea of flames. Its waters appeared to turn into liquid fire. The distinction between soldier and civilian evaporated in the heat. In the Klosterstrasse shelter, the buildings above collapsed with a dull crash of stone. The mad anxiety of the trapped reached a breaking point. Fists were pressed into mouths to stifle screams. When a 1-ton bomb vaporized the neighboring block, the panic turned physical. In the darkness, a disabled veteran was trampled underfoot as the mob surged toward an exit already choked with burning debris. Outside, the defensive methods reached a final absurd stage. German paratroopers fought room to room through the ruins of the Blind Institute. Their silk scarves, looted from abandoned homes, were now blackened with soot. They used remote-controlled tanks to level their own positions rather than let the Soviets take them. Meanwhile, children, some no older than 13, clutched anti-tank weapons in the rubble. Their eyes were fixed in a wide, frozen stare as they waited for the steel giants to emerge from the smoke. By Easter Monday, the flower of Europe was a desert of ash. It was a Sodom and Gomorrah, where the only sound was the rhythmic, heat-induced chiming of a single church bell. It echoed over a landscape of stinking horse cadavers and scorched flowers. The city was no longer a strategic objective. It was a blazing pyre for an ideology that demanded the total annihilation of everything it had once claimed to protect. By May 1st, 1945, the subterranean air in the command bunkers had become a toxic soup. It was a mixture of recycled breath, radio ozone, and the heavy sweet scent of cheap cognac. The news arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a distorted sequence of notes over the airwaves. It was the funeral march from Wagner's Twilight of the Gods. When the announcement finally crackled through that Adolf Hitler had fallen in Berlin, the reaction was not grief. It was a profound, almost joyous snap of the psychological cord. The fortress ideology was revealed in an instant as a hollow facade. In the dark corners of the cellars, officers who had spent months ordering teenagers to their deaths began to burn their documents. The flames in the courtyard bonfires licked at the night sky. They were fed by thousands of service records and party memberships. The ash drifted like black snow over a city that no longer had a reason to fight. Now, we return to that frozen road in January where the evacuation began. The German wave of mothers and children had been pushed out into the ice, leaving a trail of white mounds in the snow. As the May sun beat down on the fields, the Canth Death March reached its grisly, silent resolution. The thaw acted as a brutal revealer. The 18,000 civilians who had perished in that first week of evacuation were no longer hidden by the winter snow. As the drifts receded, the roadside ditches surrendered their secrets. The grey waxen remains of the elderly and the tiny stiff bundles of infants emerged from the mud. The sacrifice of these thousands was laid bare as entirely futile. It was a massacre of the innocent conducted for a regime that had already decided to immolate itself. The heroic defense of the city had not been a shield for these people. It had been their executioner. Inside the city, the man who had signed those death warrants prepared his final act of betrayal. On the morning of May 5th, while the Soviet infantry tightened its grip on the ruins, Gauleiter Karl Hancke stood on the runway, built over the corpses of the workers. The air was thick with the smell of burning oil and the acrid soot of the city's death throes. With the cowardice of a man who had spent months executing anyone who spoke of surrender, Hancke climbed into the city's last airworthy plane. The engine's rhythmic cough echoed off the jagged skeletons of luxury apartments as the light craft bounced down the rubble-strewn boulevard and lifted into the haze. He left behind 150,000 sacrificial pawns to face the reckoning he had invited. He flew toward a temporary escape that would end with his anonymous death at the hands of partisans. The formal surrender took place on May 6, 1945, at the Villa Colonia. The scene was one of haunting cinematic silence. General Hermann Niehoff sat in a sun-drenched room where dust motes danced in the light, his uniform torn and his eyes fixed in an Aleutian stare of total exhaustion. As the Soviet commanders looked on, there was a ritualized drink of schnapps, a fragile, surreal moment of military decorum, before the pens scratched across the papers of capitulation. But outside the villa, the illusion of the miracle of Breslau was dissolving into a night of terror. As the sun set, the formal order of surrender evaporated, replaced by a chaotic explosion of reckoning. The Red Army, fueled by the visceral memory of their own scorched villages, descended upon the ruins. In the cellars, the greeting of Heil Hitler had long since died, replaced by a hellish sound of cooking pot lids being banged through the night. This was the desperate, pathetic deterrent used by women to warn one another of approaching marauders. The city became a witch's cauldron of unspeakable atrocities and systematic looting. Soviet soldiers, their throats burning with stolen cognac, moved through the anthill of refugees, stripping watches from wrists and medals from chests. The sensory landscape was a nightmare of jarring contrasts. The scent of blooming lilac and cherry trees in the spring air clashed with the evil smell of bloated corpses rotting in the mud. Nightingales sang in the park, their melodies rising over the sobbing in the darkened hallways. By the morning of May 9th, as the smoke of the surrender still hung in the air, the first Noah's Ark pulled into the skeletal remains of the railway station. This was not a train of victors, but a collection of pioneers, Polish officials, engineers, and settlers, stepping out into a landscape that felt less like a city and more like a fresh wound. As the steam from the locomotive hissed into the stagnant, soot-heavy air, Bolesław Drobny, the city's first Polish president, stepped out into a panoramic land of the dead. The silence was absolute, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thud of a collapsing wall, or the crackle of a fire that had been burning since Easter. These newcomers were the vanguard of a geopolitical earthquake, tasked with transforming the German fortress into the Polish city of Wrocław. They had come to claim a regained territory, yet they found themselves standing in a graveyard where 70% of the buildings were hollowed-out shells and the very earth stank of broken sewage. The city was a smoldering skeleton of 600 million cubic feet of rubble, where 3,000 shattered water mains bled into the streets. The flower of Europe had been systematically hollowed out. The ensuing months were defined by a Wild West anarchy that rendered the formal surrender documents meaningless. The city became a predatory ecosystem where the remaining German population existed as ghosts in their own homes. The social fabric dissolved into the plunderer's square. In this chaotic tableau of survival, the former bourgeoisie stood in the mud, bartering their final treasures for the means to stay alive. A polished black piano, dragged from a ruined salon and warped by the spring rains, might be traded for a sack of mouldy flour. A fur coat once worn to the opera was swapped for a handful of salt. As the survivors watched, a Polish boy named Friedhelm spun like a dancing bear in the ruins to earn a scrap of bacon from a Soviet guard. It was the final pathetic pulse of a city that had been sacrificed to a war for war's sake. This was a war of symbolic erasure. Under the direction of the new administration, the de-Germanization of the city began with the chisel and the paintbrush. The inscriptions on bridges and public buildings were methodically chipped away, replaced by a mishmash of Polish names and white paint that sought to overwrite 7 centuries of history in a single summer. Statues of Wilhelm I were toppled into the rubble, and the bronze of the cathedral bells was reduced to worthless slag. For the Germans who remained, it was a hunger catastrophe that broke the spirit. They watched as their heritage was dismantled and shipped east. 165 million bricks were stripped from the ruins and loaded onto trains to reconstruct Warsaw, a literal cannibalization of one city to birth the survival of another. The finality of this rupture was sealed in the death trains of 1946 and 1947. The formal expulsion was not an orderly repatriation. It was a visceral, cold-blooded exodus. On the night of December 17, 1946, train number 514 sat on the tracks in a biting -20-degree frost. The passengers, thousands of elderly men, women and children, were loaded into unheated cattle trucks like animals prepared for slaughter. The atmosphere inside the cars was thick with the smell of soot and apathetic, violent desperation. As the heavy iron locks clicked shut with a metallic finality, the sound drew a line under the German history of the city. For 5 days, the train moved through a landscape of white shrouds, the hair of the passengers literally freezing to the wooden walls of the trucks. By the time the train reached its destination, 32 bodies were tipped into the snow, their waxen faces a silent testament to the apocalypse of 1945. Today, the unsettling feeling of home lingers in the streets of modern Wrocław. The city is a masterpiece of restoration. Yet it remains a haunted landscape where the drab grey of the cathedral spire and the bullet-scarred stones of the bridges serve as a sentinel over a buried past. The transition was a total erasure, leaving behind 2 traumatized generations. There are the displaced Germans who carry the horror film memories of the siege, and the Polish settlers who had to build their lives amidst the dead body of a foreign civilization. The flower of Europe was not merely destroyed, it was replaced, leaving the ghosts of 1945 to wander the green streets that now cover the bomb craters. It remains a permanent historical rupture, where the wind still cuts like glass through the ruins of memory. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories, and please share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.